Good morning and welcome to the FCCJ. I'm Andy Sharp of the Nikkei Asian Review and also a vice president of this club. Today I'm going to keep my introduction brief. We all know the news from last week about Prime Minister Abe's resignation. And it just so happened that, just a few days before Abe's resignation, that a new biography of the Prime Minister came out by Tobias Harris, our speaker today, who is a senior vice president at Teneo in Washington. So we're going to ask Tobias today to talk about the book and obviously discuss Abe's resignation, possible next prime minister. Everyone is saying Suga, and just looking forward to the next year or so in Japanese politics and what direction the country is likely to go in. So Tobias, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Andy. It's great to be here virtually.
Absolutely. And just as I said, there's going to be no introductory speech. We'll go straight into questions and answers. So if I can just kick this off. There's been a lot of talk, Tobias, about the title of your book, The Iconoclast, Shinzo Abe and the New Japan. I mean, some people have pointed out he's not an iconoclast. He's from the political elite. So could you just explain why you chose that title?
Sure. I feel like this is every interview I've done now. This is, if not the first question, one of the first questions. And it's an appropriate one. And for the reason you mentioned, that I think people look at how could someone whose father was a foreign minister and whose grandfather was a prime minister and his other grandfather was also a Diet member, surely that's someone who is as committed to the establishment as you can get. The fact is, though, that you look at his career from the moment he entered the Diet, he is someone who looked at the powers that be, at what you would say was the post-war establishment, and saw them as having failed in a fundamental job of making a strong state and building an independent Japan. And so he aimed his efforts, really as a young first, second term Diet member, at the elders of his own party. It's saying, you've made mistakes. You have allowed this situation to continue for too long, and my generation is going to be the one to change it. And I mean, of course, he looked back, to make the case. He did look back to his grandfather. He did draw upon this tradition, which just goes to show that within Japan's governing class, I mean, you've had different strains. There are different forms of thinking. And of course, the term for his grandfather, Kishi Nobusuke's way of thinking, they were the anti-mainstream of the LDP. And so, this was an inter-elite struggle, but he very much was aimed at overturning what had existed. And I mean, I always struggle to come up with good titles and good headlines. And so was brainstorming, and this one just popped out to explain what I think is really, an important thread that runs through the whole book.
Okay, thank you. And I'll take a question now from someone watching online. It's from Mara Bujeri at LifeGate. And it's on Japan's Abe's environmental policy. I mean, she asks, Japan has been spotlighted for its failure to revise its carbon emissions reduction targets and its continued support for coal. What does Abe leave behind in terms of environmental policy? Is it all bad?
So this is a great question, and I'm really happy that we're getting this out there right away, because one of my goals in writing this book, I mean, my original intention had been to have it come out before the Olympics, and people would be looking at Abe and looking at Abe's Japan and kind of taking stock of where things were, and wanted to write sort of the first attempt to imagine 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we're looking back, we're trying to think about, what is Abe's place in history, and as we head into the final year, and of course now, that debate is now supercharged. And one of the things that, I mean, certainly wish I'd written about it more throughout the book, but as I got to the final chapters and thinking about his legacy, I mean, I think on climate, I think it's going to be a legacy of missed opportunities. I think, and certainly as the impact of climate change is more directly felt in Japan, and it's hard to say it hasn't been between the heat waves and the floods over the last several years. I think people are going to look back at years of tremendous political stability with a government headed by the strongest prime minister Japan's maybe ever had. And I think they might ask, what did Japan do during that time? particularly when you look at Japan compared to some of its fellow democracies that had unstable governments, that had leaders who weren't able or just were unwilling to do anything about this. It's more of missed opportunities. I mean, he's said the right things. He's given speeches, written articles where he's not a denialist. I'm sitting here in the United States. It's hard for an American maybe to point fingers at any other country. I mean, so in that sense, Abe is far from the bottom and far not the most responsible when it comes to tackling climate. But you do look at the arc of his government, and were there moments where he might have actually used his political capital to push Japan, at least domestically, moving towards a more aggressive aggressive carbon emissions reductions. I mean, it's interesting. He comes into power and, he talks aggressively about restarting nuclear power plants, but then backs off in the face of court challenges and local opposition. And he never really tried to make the case for restarting nuclear power as part of a climate policy. And so there are a number of points, I think, where you could say, well, maybe he could have done things differently. Maybe he could have used his power to change public opinion on this issue and really move something aggressively forward. So again, missed opportunities, not necessarily, with some exceptions, not necessarily sins of commission.
Okay, and another question here. This is from Rocky Swift at Reuters. And of course, Abe has now stepped down twice for health reasons. So he's asking the question, what influence, if any, did Abe's own health challenges have on how he shaped policy on healthcare, in the medical system, drug regulation, etc.?
What an interesting question. I wish I don't have I wish I had a particularly compelling answer to that. I don't. I mean, it's it is interesting that early on, when he comes back in and he touts the benefits of was it Asacol, this this drug that had been approved, and early on, one of the 3 arrow policies was getting prescriptions by mail that was Mikitani pushed for. You're trying to streamline regulation. I mean, I think that was certainly a 3rd arrow theme, and maybe actually stepping back. This question in some ways points to some of the challenges of talking about what Abe accomplished in office on the economic front, because when you talk about the 3rd arrow, you end up talking about so many different things, and there was always the joke that it wasn't a 3rd arrow, it was 1,000 darts. I mean, that there were so many different policies and so many different things, included in those growth strategies year after year. And totaling up which ones worked, which ones didn't work, which ones actually were implemented, which ones never got off the drawing board. I mean, it's a tremendously difficult job. And it was something I struggled with in the course of writing the book. How do you talk about something that is so amorphous, and draw out the main themes? And so, that's not something in particular I talked about, but I certainly think early on it was part of the agenda.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the floor? Please, you have any questions from the floor? Okay, there will be soon. Okay, so let's talk about the upcoming LDP election, Tobias. Naturally, we know who's going to win. So what do you think Suga will be looking to do over the next 12 months before the next probably bigger, probably more important LDP election?
Amazing how quickly Abe has become old news. It's we're less than 2 weeks out now. It seems very unlikely that anything will change the state of the race. So yes, I think we can talk about Suga as a presumptive successor at this point. The agenda is not going to necessarily be of his making. And I think that's the first takeaway, that you look at the year ahead. He's gonna, between continuing to manage the pandemic, dealing with the economic fallout, and I know we talked about trying to find that balance in his press conference yesterday. The U.S. presidential election, I'm sure, is going to occupy a lot of attention regardless of the outcome. There are a number of different ways in which I think it could be difficult for Japan. I think related to that, you have the pending host nation support negotiations that could start sooner or later, and which will presumably drag past the U.S. elections, and who knows, if we look at the Korea example, maybe into next year, that's going to occupy a lot of attention. I think it could be a politically challenging set of negotiations. I think inheriting a worsening situation with China is going to be a problem that's going to have to be dealt with sooner rather than later, and trying to find some sort of a stable approach, at least in the near term. The potential for South Korea relations with South Korea worsening, I think, is a problem. This defense debate, which I know Abe said now he wants to try to move along in the 2 weeks he has left in office. I mean, there's still a lot, I think, packaged with that's going to have to be dealt with. So he has an agenda coming up that just, I mean, all of this stuff is, I mean, it's going to be hard to push it aside. He's going to have to find ways of dealing with it, and they don't necessarily play to his strengths, given that he doesn't have a long record in diplomacy. I mean, he's a very skilled politician, and I think people shouldn't lose sight of that when debating how long he might last and whether he wants to be a caretaker or whether he envisions something longer. I mean, I don't think you can rule out the latter scenario necessarily, even with these challenges. I mean, I think there's certainly a possibility that he might might see an opportunity to press on and to win a full 3-year term next year. So I don't think we can rule that out. But I think to get there, he's got a lot on his plate from day one.
Sure. Okay, question here from Patrick, and then we'll go to you. Yep. Come to the mic here, please.
Hello, Patrick Walter, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Mr. Harris, I have 2 questions about me. First, if you compare Abe and Mr. Suga, it seems so that Mr. Abe was one of the most influential or most active Japanese prime ministers for a long time in foreign policy. Mr. Suga does not have any experience in that. So what do you make out of that for the future international policy of Japan? And my second question is, Suga was Mr. Fix-It for Abe for the last close to 8 years. But the question in my mind is, what was his real impact on the policies? I mean, was he just the man doing the policies that were set by Abe, or did he give any intellectual input into these policies? What would give, that might be interesting to think about, what Suga will give as inputs and further impulses for future policies in Japan. Thank you.
No, thanks for, and both are really great questions, and I think get to the heart of thinking about what we might expect from Suga. I mean, I'll take the second question first, because I think in some ways opens the way to the first question, and that is, I think he was tremendously important, not just as doing what was told. I mean, I think, and there've been a number of accounts written about the decision-making process within the Abe government. And one of the things that worked well compared to 2006, 2007 was that you did have this small group from the beginning, Abe, Suga, the deputy chief cabinet secretaries, Abe's secretary Imai, meeting together regularly to deal with some of the key issues that were on the government's agenda, ensuring that the government was speaking with a consistent message, ensuring that debating what the decision should be in terms of addressing these key policy issues. And so he was very much there. I mean, I don't think you can say that he's someone who doesn't have his own ideas for how to govern, or what how Japan should be governed. And in some ways, I think he there are certain elements, there's certain ways in which I think he pushed Abe in directions that Abe didn't necessarily want to go. The best example to me is the 2018 migrant work visa reform that I don't think Abe really was that keen on. I mean, I think Abe gradually came around to the idea of finding ways to admit more workers, and he handed that off to Suga, and Suga was the one who designed the policy. Now, the results, I think, were disappointing in the first year after it was rolled out. But in terms of ideas, I mean, I think Suga does. I mean, I think he's perhaps even more of a political realist than Abe, and maybe even more of a realist in a global sense, and recognizing what Japan needs to do to ensure its survival and its prosperity going forward. I mean, I think Abe came to that view over time, as he some of the harder ideological edges softened, I think, over his time in office. But Suga, I think, has been there all along. And you look at the book he wrote in 2012 about using the bureaucracy. I mean, I think Suga in many respects, more than a lot of LDP politicians even, has a claim to being a national politician with a national perspective. He's not, he doesn't belong to a faction. He grew up in rural Japan, but then made his career in urban Japan. I mean, I think he has a more holistic view of politics and of government maybe than a lot of other people who've occupied the post of prime minister. So, I mean, if you were looking for reasons to be optimistic about him as a prime minister, that's certainly I would think those are reasons for being optimistic. That I don't think he's he was not just a tool for Abe to implement his agenda. I think he did have a hand in formulating that. On this question of his foreign policy experience and what we would expect on foreign policy, I mean, he might be helped in the near term by the fact that there's just not that much symmetry going on, and so he's not going to have to do quite as much traveling. But over time, I mean, clearly that's going to be something he's going to have to work on. He's going to have to build those relationships. Now, I know he was talking about how saw a quote somewhere in the last couple of days about how he was on all of those phone calls between Abe and Trump. I mean, that's why. I mean, he's certainly not ignorant of the issues. He certainly knows what Japan needs to do internationally. I think it raises the stakes in who he chooses as his foreign minister, who becomes the defense minister, particularly given the debate going forward, whether he retains Abe's national security advisor, whether he picks his own. And I think with that in mind, knowing that the thing that Suga has, I think his reputation is greatest as a master of personnel selection. And so you have to expect that he's not unaware of the areas in which maybe he needs, a particularly strong personality and a capable person in certain cabinet posts. And overall, I mean, I think we'll learn a lot about how he plans to govern from the cabinet lineup he unveils.
Okay, thank you. You had a question? Yep.
My name is Kurt Sieber. I'm an associate member. On next Monday, I will be 60 years in Japan, and I like Japan very much. And my takeaway from these 8 years is that Abe-san put Japan on the world map in a very aggressive way and with good results. On the other hand, the balance between what he's doing abroad and what he's doing locally in Japan, I found for many, many years now that Japan is getting too short. And what do you think the new government should do to love Japan more than just love the next election? Thank you.
So I mean, I absolutely agree with your first point. And when you look at a positive side of Abe's legacy, I mean, I think making Japan visible in ways that it hadn't been for a long time, and converting his political stability at home into regional and global leadership. I mean, I think he absolutely did that. And the numbers bear it out. That he was present in ways maybe that a Japanese leader hadn't been ever. I mean, 81 foreign trips total in his almost 8 years. Something 170 something countries visited. I mean, it's a remarkable record of investing the time and the energy and being committed to making to making Japan a player, to recognizing that if Japan wanted to counter China's influence in the region, it had to show up and it had to be offering something politically, economically, in some cases militarily, or at least in terms of aid for defense. I mean, all of that is part of his legacy, and there's no question. And it's definitely, I think, it's raised the bar, I think, for any leader who follows him, that there's now this expectation that Japan is going to show up, that Japan is going to contribute in ways that it had before, that it's going to have a strategy that it's going to be following, and it's going to invest in these relationships across Asia in ways that hadn't been done before. And so all of that, I think, is true. To your second question, I mean, his domestic legacy is definitely mixed. There's plenty of areas of disappointment. I think there's plenty of areas in which he ought to have invested maybe more of that political capital to move reforms forward. I mean, I think you saw he got started, for example, on agricultural reform, but it fell off the agenda after kind of the initial victories. Corporate governance reform, he got it sort of, the first rounds, but then the follow-up was disappointing. I mean, I think there were areas in which maybe he could have pushed harder on. We talked about climate change earlier. But I mean, I also want to mention and stress maybe that when thinking about his legacy and recognizing, that the second longest stretch of growth, during the post-war period, yes, it was short. Yes, it halted in the face of a consumption tax hike last year, and now Japan finds itself in recession due to the pandemic. But the employment numbers, which Abe always liked to talk about on the campaign trail, those numbers matter. Having the lowest unemployment rate, having the highest jobs to applicant ratio ever, you're giving school leavers an embarrassment of riches when it comes to finding a job out of school. When you consider the decades that preceded that, and memories of the lost generations, these graduates who graduated into horrible job markets, and how that's affected their life chances ever since. I mean, the fact that you've had year after year of just a robust job market for young Japanese in particular, but for really for everyone, and female participation now being higher than the United States and some other countries that Japan had lagged before. I mean, all of that means something. All of that, I think, is also part of his legacy, and will make a difference. Given the way Japan's labor market is structured, is going to make a difference in the lives of all the people who benefited from that, from that robust growth. And so we should minimize that. Even if it was short-term growth, it still had a meaningful impact at home for a lot of people.
Okay, thank you. Just before I continue your question, I'm just going to make an announcement. So we have an email address. So people watching online, it's news@fccj.or.jp. news@fccj.or.jp for any questions online. Thank you. And Karen.
I am Karen, working for several French media. I have two questions. The first one is about Abe and Suga and their behavior with the journalist. For my part, I think they never answer exactly to the question asked. And what do you think if Suga doesn't change the behavior he had during 8 years as a spokesman of the government? Second question is about the companies. Do you think that the companies are in better shape now than when Abe became prime minister? Or are they in better shape when you look at the share, but when you look at the industrial activities, is it in a better shape? Thanks.
Sure. And the first question is a great question, and I mean, it's definitely one of the I mean, I think one of Abe's worst traits is that that I think he was always he never liked being questioned. I think maybe it might be the nice way of putting it. And he always wanted to explain his policies harder, and that would be the answer. And he always, I think, begrudged time that he had to spend facing questioning in the Diet. And so I think instinctively, his vision of democracy, let's say, was not freewheeling debate and compromise and questions. That he very much, I think, wanted to move Japan away from a style of democracy, I think, that made room for kind of minority opinions or compromise across party lines and sort of forging consensus in that process. I had majorities, I control the government, my policies are what I want to do, and this is a view of democracy he inherited from his grandfather. I mean, his grandfather's memoirs, he talks about this, and the importance of a leader is standing 2 to 3 steps ahead of the public, leading the way, not letting the public debate things out, not letting sort of leaving things to chance. I mean, the goal, the leader should set the direction, and if he has a majority and the process favors it, then the country will follow the government. I mean, of course, there are plenty of areas in which he compromised. I mean, this is not a description of every decision he made, but I mean, I think as his ideal for how democracy should function, that was, I think, what he would have liked. And I think in many ways, I think he did move Japan more towards a majoritarian kind of, and without saying dictatorship. I mean, his critics call him a dictator. I don't think you have to go to that. I mean, I think he just wanted a textbook Westminster style, elective dictatorship, where if a prime minister has the votes and the diet, that should be the end of the story. Moved in that direction, but not purely. And I think we found plenty of areas where there was some resistance. But I do think we found that the relationship with the press did not function well for Japan's democracy. And part of that was, the government not wanting, to take questions it didn't like. I mean, and not answering questions directly, and playing favorites with media outlets, that was certainly, I think, part of its approach. Martin Fackler in particular, I like what he's written about this, that on the Japanese media side of things, that you didn't have this kind of ethos in the Japanese press of, okay, we're gonna band together, we're gonna stand with each other, and not let the government get away with not answering our questions. So, I mean, I think there's definitely a need for some evolution, and that if you're going to continue to have governments that take this approach, the Japanese media does have to step up. It does have to take a more sophisticated approach and try to get the answers it needs from the government. To the second question, this is an interesting time to ask about the health of Japanese companies, because, of course, for many small and medium-sized businesses, I mean, they're hanging on by a thread and really dependent on the assistance of the government to get through this. And so, I mean, we'll see what happens as they emerge from this. I mean, at least the Japanese government has continued to provide the support that they need. And it's certainly ironic that for years, lots of debate about how the one thing the Abe government had to find a way to unlock these cash holdings of big Japanese companies, that was the secret, that had to get into wages, that had to go to dividends, that money had to be circulated. And then, of course, this crisis hits, and it turns out that it's not a bad thing that they were sitting on these reserves, and it's certainly helped them make it through as well. So, I mean, I think life is going to look different maybe for corporate Japan anyway. I mean, I think as everyone adapts to a world of more working from home, and what exactly that means for office culture, dealing with the fact that there's been more change on working styles reform in 6 months than in the 3 or 4 years before that. I mean, I think there's a lot of change that is yet to come, which in some ways is the story of the Abe government. There's a lot of decisions were put off, and his successors will have to deal with them.
Okay, we've got a question here from Simon Denyer at the Washington Post online. He's asking, can you talk a little about the influence of Nippon Kaigi under Abe, and perhaps its likely influence under Suga, and maybe talk a little about Abe's legacy in terms of reckoning with the legacy of World War II?
Sure. Thank you, Simon, for that. I mean, I'm on record in various settings as being skeptical when it comes to talking about Nippon Kaigi's influence. For a couple of reasons. I mean, first, sometimes I think the way people talk about making it's like the Illuminati or puppet masters, controlling the strings of Japanese life. When I think the actual way to think about it is that it is a pressure group, like many other such groups in Japanese society, an interest group, and its interest happened to be, defending and advancing a particular vision of Japanese society that is a throwback to an older Japan. But like many pressure groups in Japanese society and pretty much any other democracy, it's much better at stopping things it doesn't like than actually imposing its agenda on anyone. And for me, the example of for Nippon Kaigi and its history is that in 2005 to 2006, when Koizumi starts talking about the possibility of changing the imperial succession law to allow women to inherit the throne, Nippon Kaigi mobilizes, pushes back. That discussion is basically quashed, before it really gets going. that's the kind of thing I think they're capable of. But the idea that if you didn't have Nippon Kaigi, you wouldn't have Abe, or if you didn't have Nippon Kaigi, you wouldn't have just sort of this block of I call them in my book, I call them the new conservatives. I just don't think that's true. I think Nippon Kaigi, its emergence in the post-Cold War decade reflected a change, a broader change in society. People like Abe were in politics, were thinking about this stuff without, before Nippon Kaigi existed. And so, I don't know if you really needed Nippon Kaigi, to exist for a rightward shift, certainly within the LDP. I'm a little skeptical when people talk about a rightward shift in Japanese society in general, but certainly within the LDP, you had these people entering politics, and of course, then once you have them in politics, and you have someone like Abe in a position to sponsor people for election, they get senior enough, then the numbers spread. So, for example, Abe, in 2005 helped bring Inada into politics, and so this process I think repeated itself. It was helped by a couple, I think, of fortuitous events. In 2009, LDP loses. A lot of older LDP members leave. Some who kept their seats then just decided to retire anyway. So the center of gravity shifted rightward, because then in 2012, when they come back, a lot of the people who replaced the Diet members who lost in 2009 tended to be more right wing, because Abe was the leader of the party. These were the kind of people who were getting, who were being chosen to run as LDP candidates, and I think it just shifted the balance of the party rightward. Again, I think you can tell that story without even mentioning Nippon Kaigi. I don't come back to it over and over again. It's certainly mentioned, comes up in the book, but it is not something that I keep coming back to, because I think you can tell Abe's story. You can tell the story of a rightward shift in Japan without needing Nippon Kaigi to explain why that happens. You can see it as a symptom, not as an underlying cause. And really, just back to this point about whether Nippon Kaigi was better at blocking things or creating things. Look at Abe's lack of success in achieving, I think, one of his core conservative agenda items, and certainly something that Nippon Kaigi wanted, and that is revising the Constitution. This was something that Abe had pushed for since the start of his career. He, I think, eroded the taboo for talking about it, and then in 2017, proposing his own constitutional revisions. I think that was a milestone. But when it came time to actually build up the political support and find a way to get it through the Diet, even with supermajorities, supermajority in one house and sort of a quasi supermajority in the upper house, they couldn't get it done. And I think it was very unlikely that had somehow they got it through the Diet, that you would have gotten a majority of the public to back it. And so, I think it can be overstated just how influential it was. Even, doing the head counts of how many cabinet members belong to it, and doing those kind of head counts increasingly, I think, are not very helpful, because it end up becoming such an effective signaling device to conservative LDP voters. It's sort of a cheap signal. Yes, I'm conservative too. Don't worry about me. So you get someone who I think is relatively dovish, like Mr. Kishida, who ostensibly is a member of Nippon Kaigi, but doesn't necessarily share their priorities or their aims, or someone like Mr. Tanigaki, the former LDP leader, also listed as a member of Nippon Kaigi, but never, I think, stressed the kind of things that they cared about. When you look at the kind of LDP members that are on the list of ostensibly Nippon Kaigi affiliated Diet members, you realize that it's not a very valuable signal for what's important to a politician.
Okay, we've got a follow-up question here from Simon. And this is definitely something you'll be well aware of. The question is, did Abe handle Donald Trump well? And should Japan be worried about a Trump victory, especially without Abe around?
So this is a big question, and certainly probably one of the biggest questions that Suga is going to be thinking about these days. I think in the scheme of things, because we can't, it's hard to know the alternative. It's definitely easier to imagine ways in which the U.S.-Japan relationship could have gone considerably worse under a Trump, with the Trump administration. And whether, I think we can safely say that Abe's personal diplomacy with Trump didn't change his mind. I think Trump, never stopped talking about how unfair the alliance is, and reports about how even last year was talking about bringing U.S. troops home and ending the alliance. You're talking about constantly about how unfair the trading relationship is. So we never managed, I think, to change Trump's mind, which meant that I think a lot of times the personal diplomacy was maybe to shield some of the alliance managers, some of the professionals, from Trump's ideas about the alliance. I mean, and I think in that sense, I think he often was effective. You had, I think it's very easy to see how, for example, the trade negotiations could have been different. Could have been worse. That auto tariff threat that got Japan to the table, had that actually been carried out, I mean, I think that would have been, absolutely disastrous for Abe. And to the extent that he was able to avert that, by agreeing to trade negotiations that ended up not being that different from what what had been agreed as part of the TPP negotiations. I mean, that, again, considering that it could have been worse, it didn't go so badly for Abe. So I mean, I don't think you can say that it was an outright failure. I mean, I think it was an unusual interval, I think, for the U.S. and Japan, and for a relationship between the U.S. and Japanese leaders. But I don't think I wouldn't call it a failure. No.
Okay. And
should I pick up the Suga part of that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Suga Trump, the
Sure.
non-Abe Japanese government dealing with, should Trump win, how that would work out.
Well, I mean, should Trump win? I mean, you're going to have a very immediate question that's going to have to be answered, and that is, what do you do, when a Trump administration comes, and particularly fresh from an electoral victory, and says, it's host nation support negotiation time, and this is what we're asking for, and it's a lot more than what Japan's been paying before. And is there going to be what sort of domestic constituency is there going to be for agreeing to that in these circumstances? And then what are the risks that you get if those negotiations drag on? It looks like Japan's holding out. Does Trump then start wielding some of the more aggressive threats to pull U.S. forces out or to end the alliance? I mean, what happens if those negotiations get prolonged? I mean, I think that's got to be the biggest question on Suga's mind, and certainly the biggest challenge in foreign relations going forward. And I mean, at this point, I don't think we can say, but I think it's one of the biggest questions at stake for Japan on November 3rd.
Okay, just a quick follow-up question from me now. So the polls in recent weeks have put Ishiba well ahead of the other LDP candidates in terms of the public popularity. So do you think that going forward into a possible general election, that, because Suga doesn't seem to be so popular with the public, this could hurt the LDP? And especially given that the opposition finally seems to be coming together into one kind of force, although we don't exactly know how that's going to work. So just in terms of Suga's personality and how he resonates with the public, do you think he's going to be able to, like Abe, to go ahead and go out there and consistently win elections for the LDP?
Yeah, I mean, the question of whether his legitimacy is going to be dented by the manner of his election, I mean, I think the precedents from LDP history aren't promising on that front. On the other hand, you can see how the public might be forgiving given the circumstances. And I mean, and although Ishiba has been well ahead, I mean, Suga has ticked up as I think he's become a more realistic prospect. So there's certainly, I mean, I think it's certainly possible that he'll enjoy a honeymoon when the time comes. That I don't think he's going to take office with approval ratings in the 40s. I mean, I would certainly be surprised. I mean, given that I think at the start leaders are often given the benefit of the doubt. I'd like to think there are things about his biography that could serve him well, just in terms of building up public support of his own, that then could be used in campaign season. I mean, the fact that he is not a hereditary politician, right? He is Abe's opposite in so many ways. Abe being this blue blood from a political thoroughbred from this distinguished family, and Suga being the son of a strawberry farmer, and having made the journey to to Tokyo with so many other Japanese of his generation, and then finding his way into politics and being a classic as they used to say about the LDP, a Toljinha kind of guy, working at the working in local politics and building a reputation locally, and then jumping to the Diet. I mean, he's sort of a throwback in that way. And he does have, I think, incredible political skills. I mean, he has great relationships, I think, throughout the LDP, which is how I think he was able to pull off the feat that we've seen in the last week, with the help of Mr. Nikai. And so I wouldn't underestimate him just based on what we know about his skills. The fact that I think there are things about his biography. I mean, he hasn't necessarily been given a chance to maybe be that kind of retail politician, but there are certainly hints of maybe a political personality that might actually resonate and that might turn into an electoral advantage. I mean, I think that whether he actually is in a position to call a snap election, whether he leads the LDP into election, is going to be one of the more interesting questions coming up. I mean, whether he has the political room just with events. Will the pandemic allow him to call an election? Will his coalition partner allow him to call an election? Depending on what happens with the U.S. elections. I mean, it can see a lot of different ways in which he might have opportunities, but also just might be blocked. And if he does ultimately seem like a caretaker, I mean, then you can easily conceive of him passing the reins to someone else in a year and getting an election early on to give that next leader a chance to build a mandate. So it's way too early to call which way it's going to go. It's definitely possible to sketch out a couple of different plausible scenarios.
And the opposition, do you ever sort of see them, becoming a viable government at any point in the future?
Well, you can't say at any point, but I think they've got some years. In some ways, this merger that's about to take place, which basically looks like putting the DPJ back together with a few difficult personalities on the outside, which might not be the worst thing. In some ways, it's an admission of failure. I mean, I was just talking about this with someone, in an event recently. I remember in 2017, I was in Japan for that general election and was hopping around Tokyo, going to campaign events and trying to pick up the mood. And I mean, I was excited by the Constitutional Democrats. I thought, Edano was, I think he's an earnest politician. I think he brings a lot to the table. And I think the party's approach, they didn't want to just recreate the DPJ. They did want to build a new brand. They did want to bring new people into politics. They didn't want to run people at the local level. They did want to find new candidates to run nationally, all of which I think was for the good. I mean, and I think, to be successful, I think the opposition does have to find a way to move beyond memories of the DPJ years. And maybe under new leadership that will be possible. At some point, Abe continued to run against the DPJ during his subsequent general elections. I mean, at some point that's not going to work anymore. And there's just going to be enough history that, invoking the memories of 2012 or 2011, that's not going to work anymore. And hopefully there'll be just more turnover over time in who the opposition politicians are, who the faces of that opposition party are, will change enough that people are willing to give them a chance again. But it's going to take time. And you look at the rise of the DPJ in the first place. I mean, it took time for voters to, I think, come to trust them and come to believe that they could govern. And we're still, I think, a few years away from that.
Okay, you have a question? Yeah.
One more question about Abe. Do you think that one more time, one more comeback is possible from Abe? He also already changed the rules of the LDP to enjoy 3 terms. So can you change it once again to come back?
I've seen this speculated about. I'd be very surprised if he had another comeback in him. I mean, again, he's not as young as he was when he came back for the first time. He's certainly not as young as when he was elected for the first time in 2006. And at some point, I think the LDP already was ready for generational change, for some new faces and new opportunities, for leadership. So I don't see it. I mean, I think that raises the question, though, of what his role will be and how much longer he'll continue to have a Diet seat, what he might do from the backbenches. I mean, I even wonder given Suga's lack of diplomatic experience, do you see, does he play a role as an informal envoy early on? Once it becomes possible to travel, does he do? Does Suga entrust him to perform diplomatic missions? I mean, actually, and if you were looking at his grandfather's model, Kishi was certainly doing that after he left the premiership, and he helped his brother Sato, for example, with the Japan-Korea Treaty in 1965. I mean, so there's other roles for him to play, I think, other than coming back, but I'd be very surprised if he had another comeback in him.
Just a follow-up from Karen.
Yes, a follow-up. Imagine he come back 2 years later, he will still be younger than Suga now.
That's true.
But and the next generation, who is the best figure and the best people in the next generation in the LDP?
Well, I mean, I think this year, I think we've been watching Mr. Kono emerge as a more plausible kind of next in line leader, maybe after Suga, than we had seen before. And he still probably has some work to do to ensure that he'd have enough support within the party, if and when he runs. But I mean, I think he certainly looks considerably more plausible even than a few years ago, when he was this, as everyone likes to describe him, a maverick, with unconventional views and maybe just a little too smart to be an LDP leader. I mean, the LDP, I mean, I think the LDP doesn't always go for, the best, the most expert in policy. I mean, I think Ishiba has suffered from this to some extent, that, he's a guy who obviously, knows the details, he knows all the facts, all the, has great ideas, is always, generating new ideas, writing books. That's not always what I think the LDP is looking for in its leader. I think Kono has suffered from that image maybe in the past. And I think his time in government maybe has changed that. I mean, I think he's looked, really like a capable minister in different jobs and I think challenging jobs, and has shown an ability to use some of his political talents at the service of being an effective cabinet minister. So I think that positions him well. We love to talk about Koizumi Shinjiro. I mean, I think he, I don't deny, I think he has, does have tremendous political talents. Back in 2017, during that general election campaign, I made a point of seeing him on the trail, and I think he's the real deal. I mean, I think, and in some ways is probably even more of a policy wonk than his father was. His father was charisma and had a few big ideas, but Shinjiro, I think impressively, is really doing the work, and is, I think, focused on studying the kind of issues that a prime minister in the late 2020s is going to probably have to deal with. He's done a lot of work on fiscal policy, and how to revive depressed rural areas, and the kind of issues that aren't, as he himself might say, not the sexiest issues, but they're issues that are important and need to be addressed. And I think adding environmental issues to his portfolio as minister is probably not a bad thing for him either. So I think he's certainly someone to watch for. Obviously, I think this can be a couple times around, and I think he needs more ministerial experience and more party leadership experience. But certainly him. I wish there were more women in the mix. Noda, should be part of the discussion, but I still think she needs probably another big cabinet job or two to really be part of that discussion. But it's after her, it's really hard to think about. I mean, and as has been much discussed over the last week, I mean, one of Abe's biggest shortcomings, to talk about, wanting to promote women's advancement, but then to not work harder to get more women into the LDP and then kind of move them up the ladder, I think was a shortcoming.
Okay. Yes. Any more questions from the floor after this? More than welcome.
Yeah. Once again, first, a small question. Where is your book available? Can I get it at Azo? Please tell us where we can get it, because
yes, no, of course. and for my publisher Hearst, that's the most important question of all. So the international release has been a little complicated, and I mean, you know, the publishing industry is having challenges due to the pandemic, and that's what I mean. My release was supposed to be May, and was pushed back to August, and you know, to the day before Abe's resignation, just by chance because of the pandemic. So I believe it is out in Japan. Depends on where you're buying it from. I think if you go to Kinokuniya or Maruzen, I believe they have it in stock. Amazon Japan, I'm told, is sourcing it from the United States, where it is not out yet, where Oxford University Press is distributing it. Although I'm told that they might be moving forward the release a little bit, so that it might also be available from Amazon Japan sometime in the next several weeks. But I believe the big bookstores do have it. But you know, this is something my publisher, I think we're working on it to make sure that it's available.
Well, thank you. My real question is just to follow up on the list for the future. What is your view of Kishida, because he is now pretty much in the limelight? So what chance do you see for him?
You know, at some point his window of opportunity is gonna close if it hasn't already. You know, I think he paid a big reputational cost in 2018 when he decided that he wasn't going to run and was just going to bide his time until Abe was ready to leave. And this year we've seen that might, I mean, maybe he was unlikely to win in 2018, but maybe he would look stronger this time around, because I think waiting, he ended up having very little to go on other than kind of a promise from Abe that he would be the successor. And we discovered pretty quickly that, you know, when it actually came time to make a decision, I think Abe took a look at Kishida and didn't see him as someone really up to the job. And you know, I think it was a quote either from Aso or someone near Aso in one of the tabloids saying that, you know, Kishida, you know, completely unfit in, you know, a wartime circumstance, you know, that given the gravity of the situation Japan faces, that he doesn't have the capacity to do the job now. And I think I mean, there just might also be something to his thin resume. I mean, yes, he was a long tenured foreign minister, but he was also a long tenured foreign minister in a government in which the prime minister was in many ways conducting his own foreign policy and relying on a national security advisor and people in the Conte, rather than, you know, leaning on his foreign minister. So I mean, there are a couple of, you know, achievements you can point to. The 2015 agreement with South Korea that did not much outlast his tenure as foreign minister, and getting Obama to Hiroshima, which was important. But you know, that experience as foreign minister, it's increasingly in the distance, and it's not that much to run on when it comes to, you know, does Kishida have kind of the mettle to govern? And being the LDP policy chief, I mean, maybe that helped him build this, you know, a deeper resume, but it's hard to see what really came out of that. And you know, meanwhile, you had the debacle earlier this year where Kishida and Abe agreed to do you know, stimulus that would be limited to people most in need, and then immediately have to reverse course after Komeito and Nikai push back against that. You know, it's not a good record. I mean, you realize he doesn't actually really have that much to run on. And also you wonder about the dynamics within the LDP as well. I mean, given that the balance, the center of gravity ideologically has moved to the right, I mean, you really wonder, you know, was Kishida really going to convince kind of you know, the right-wing bloc that stood behind Abe all these years? Were they really going to back Kishida if, you know, even if he was Abe's choice? I mean, and I mean, it's curious and it's hard to see, but I mean, now it's a moot point. But you know, he's young enough. In theory, he could run again. You know, he will presumably be part of the mix, you know, in discussions about who's in what cabinet job. But, you know, after, you know, this year, in 2018, it's really hard to see there being circumstances where he would have a chance to finally win it.
Okay, go to Patrick first, and then you.
Hello, Patrick Welter once again. Talking about the potential successor of Mr. Suga, or the potential generational shift in the LDP, the question remains when this is going to happen. What is your best guess? Is this going to happen next year, or do we have to wait more years under Suga?
Given that he's not even in the job yet, it's hard to make a hard call yet. And I mean, at this point, like I said, I can see plausible scenarios in both cases, but I think we should be careful not to rule out the possibility that Suga doesn't actually want to just be a caretaker for a year. I don't think the public necessarily wants that. I mean, I think it was Nikkei's poll over the weekend suggesting that overwhelmingly, I think the public preferred a prime minister at least to serve this year and then an additional 3-year term. So I don't think we can rule out the possibility. I mean, yes, Suga is older than most post-war prime ministers, which is funny to think about given Japan's demographics. But he's also, I mean, he's not 79 like Aso. I mean, he's turning 72 in December. Looking at the United States, I mean, it'd be nice if the United States had young spry leaders like who were 72. I mean, I'm just joking with that, but I mean, the point is, I mean, I don't think you can rule out that he actually has the fitness to run next year, assuming he can manage the challenges of this year, that he can overcome some of the obstacles that he's going to face from day one. He certainly has a shot at it. I think he has the political skills to do it. I think if he can make the case that that the public is behind him and that he looks like someone who could win an election, I don't see any reason why the LDP wouldn't stay united behind him. And having thrown it, having with most of the factions having thrown their weight behind him already, and to give him this chance. I mean, I certainly think there's a path for him to win a 3-year term in his own right and to govern for a solid stretch.
Okay, I'll come to Karen in a second. It's kind of a follow-up to Patrick's question. It's from Simon Denya. Does Ishiba have a chance in 2021?
Again, someone whose window of opportunity might well be closing. I mean, and I like him. He knows his policy. I think he is in some ways under-recognized the extent to which I think he said the right things about Japan's need to get along with its neighbors, especially South Korea, which Japan certainly could use now. But the way the elections are structured, unless it is an absolute catastrophe under Suga and the party's support collapses, and the party turns to Ishiba in a moment of desperation because he is the most well liked, and so that he rides to the rescue because there's no one else. Actually, in some ways, in much the same way that Koizumi ended up becoming prime minister in 2001. Unless you have a repeat of that kind of situation, it just seems hard for Suga or for Ishiba to ever make the case to his fellow lawmakers that he should be given the leadership. And it's not happening this time around. And unless things change a lot over the next year, it might not be next year either.
Okay, thank you. And Karen, we'll probably have to make this the last question.
What is the biggest challenge for Suga? Is it coronavirus or is it Olympics? Maybe the decision will have to be made very quickly regarding the Olympics. So do you have any view on that?
I think it has to be coronavirus. I mean, just, given the ease with which you could see, numbers begin to rise again. I mean, I think, lost in the politics. I mean, Japan has, once again, I think managed to keep its case numbers under control after, I think fears, over the summer. And, so it seems that, they're going to keep with the approach that they've been pursuing so far under Suga, I think, obviously. But, given the ease with which things could change, I mean, looking at what's happening in Europe now, looking at what's happening happened in South Korea over the last couple of weeks, easily that I think is going to be the biggest challenge. And, clearly the Olympics are connected to that. But I think we saw in the spring, when it became clear, who declaring it a pandemic, clearly, the public was willing to understand that it had to be delayed pretty quickly. And if circumstances required it again to be delayed or canceled. I mean, is that a policy compared to some of the other issues on the agenda? Not necessarily. So.
Okay, we'll sneak in one final question. Sorry about that. Is that okay with you, Tobias? You don't
Yeah, I'll take it. That's fine.
A CNN interview or something coming up?
No, just bedtime.
Okay.
This question will be very short. What do you think is the future of the abductee issue without Abe?
So can you give your name and affiliation, please? Your name and affiliation. Sorry.
Todd Kroll with Freelance.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that question. I mean, obviously, it was a big part of Abe's rise, and I spend a decent chunk of my book talking about the role that played in his rise. Clearly, it was an issue that Abe was invested in ways that no Japanese leader could match. I mean, certainly no prime minister could match. And it's certainly possible that Suga is, because he is, I think, more of a realist and less invested in the issue, might be able to take a different approach. But I mean, I think you'd first have to, at this point, Japan, I think, is not necessarily in a position to set its own pace when it comes to relations with North Korea. I mean, I think, the overall environment between the US and North Korea, what's happening between North and South Korea, North Korea and China. I think the other countries of the region, I think, are setting the pace when it comes to when and how North Korea is willing to talk. Maybe if depending on what happens with the U.S. presidential election, and depending on what approach you get from a U.S. administration, maybe North Korea decides that it wants to try to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Japan, and so reaches out to a new Japanese prime minister who's maybe a little more flexible on the issue. I mean, there's certainly more possible for movement under any different prime minister. Doesn't mean it's guaranteed to happen, because I think the issue is still a potent one. Abe is not going away, and I think that if it looked like Japan were signing on to a bad deal or giving concessions to North Korea without getting the kind of information it needed from North Korea, I don't doubt that Abe would make his opinions known. So we can't go too far in thinking that this opens great new possibilities. But I think there's possibility for more flexibility under subsequent leaders than there might have been during the Abe years.
Okay, on that note, we'll bring this to a close. Tobias, thank you very much indeed. And I hope things go well with the book. And I believe our office is sending you a year's honorary membership for speaking today. So hopefully we're going to see you.
If I can get over there.
We're all hoping to travel soon, I'm sure. But hopefully we'll be able to see you in Tokyo, and we can all go for a drink in the bar or something.
Fantastic. I look forward to it, and hopefully that day is soon.
Okay, bring it to a close. Thank you.
Thank you.